Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. My name is Robert Lorandini, and I'm currently a student at North Shore University Hospital, LIUP Post, School of Cardiovascular Perfusion. I'm going to be presenting my thesis project on venous saturation monitoring for oxygenation control during cardiopulmonary bypass. I have no disclosures at this time. So medical equipment in general should be tested to the highest standard, especially equipment that provides cardiopulmonary bypass support during open heart surgery. The Association for Advancement of Medical Instrumentation is responsible for providing the guidelines and standards necessary for manufacturers to follow when considering the performance capability of an oxygenator. So AMI recommends testing the oxygenators with a venous inlet condition of 65 plus or minus 5% and a hematocrit of 36 plus or minus 3%. So one could assume that these ranges may not represent the patient population undergoing bypass adequately. Every patient obviously presents with various clinical and diagnostic differences, and no one patient is the same. So these are the AMI recommended inlet blood conditions for oxygenator testing. The two important parameters that I'm going to use for this study are venous oxyhemoglobin saturation and hematocrit concentration. So this study is going to assess the venous saturations of patients undergoing cardiopulmonary bypass to see if AMI standards are addressing this patient population adequately, take it a step further and determine whether venous saturations can be used to predict PO2 on cardiopulmonary bypass. Lastly, utilizing these preoperative venous saturations possibly create an equation that can be used to adjust onset FiO2 settings. So my hypothesis, so real clinical data for patient preoperative venous saturations and hematocrit are not reflected in AMI ISO recommendations, and venous saturations can be used to predict partial pressure of arterial oxygen on cardiopulmonary bypass. So this was a one-center study conducted from July 2018 to January 2019 in Brooklyn, New York. Similar anesthesia technique was used for all patients. The important parameters in this study used in the statistical analysis were cardiac index, SVO2, venous PO2, hematocrit, and arterial PO2. For each patient, a venous sample was drawn as soon as blood reached the microclave adapter directly on my venous line before commencement of cardiopulmonary bypass, giving us a true venous sample, and one arterial sample was taken once on bypass. The EPOC blood gas analyzer was used. Onset FiO2 settings were adjusted based on perfusion preference, or whoever my preceptor was at the time, from 55% to 100%. So 37 patients were studied and divided into three groups. Group A had patients who had a pre-op SVO2 of more than 70%. Group B had patients who had a preoperative SVO2 between 60 and 70, which is the AMI standard. And Group C had patients who had a preoperative SVO2 of less than 60%. One-way ANOVA with post-hoc Tukey HSD testing and correlation studies were used for statistical analysis of the data. The cardiopulmonary bypass machine used was the Sorin S5 with a Terumo FX25 oxygenator. So results and discussion. Cardiac index and hematocrit were not significantly different among the groups. So this is important just because hematocrit and cardiac index can have an effect on your pre-op venous saturation. So since they were not significantly different, we can assume that the other parameters in this study were all affected similarly, which is important. Also, the average hematocrit for each group was not within the AMI standards for oxygenator testing. As you can see, 18.9% of patients had hematocrits within the AMI testing range, leaving 81.1% of patients outside of the recommended testing range. So this table shows the percentage of patients in groups A, B, and C. So only 21.6% of patients fell within the AMI testing range, 10.8% of patients were below the AMI testing range, and 67.6% of patients were above the AMI testing range. So to put in perspective, 78.4% of patients in this study did not fall within the AMI testing range for blood gas oxygenators. So AMI ISO standards also recommend onset FiO2 settings at 100%. FiO2 settings in perfusion have definitely been debated, with some setting their FiO2 at 100 regardless of the patient. Others will choose to set their onset FiO2 based on patient's BSA or start at 100 and decrease after cooling, and so on. Some perfusionists are comfortable with PO2s in the 250 to 300 range, which is still considered hyperoxia, just to a lesser degree. An oxygenator's ability to oxygenate varies from patient to patient, and one must consider a variety of variables. So one of the important variables to consider is preoperative venous saturation. And in order to see the degree to which venous sat has an impact on oxygenation, I made a graph which is FiO2 versus the first arterial PO2 on cardiopulmonary bypass. So this figure just gives insight into what PO2s were produced from a certain FiO2 on cardiopulmonary bypass. Patients who had a pre-op venous sat of greater than 70 had an R-squared value of 0.029. So the line of best fit has a negative slope. This obviously doesn't reflect proportionality in regard to FiO2 and PO2. This shows minimal to no correlation, and so there's probably no predictability for patients that have a venous saturation above 70. But what's more interesting is that patients within the AMI standard, or 60 to 70% pre-op venous sat, and patients below 60, they show a little more encouraging evidence in terms of predictability. So group B had an R-squared value of 0.72 and group C 0.79. So this is going to show that patients that fall within that pre-op SVO2 range below 70 can have some predictability when controlling oxygenation. So in order to utilize the power that the patients in these groups had in terms of predictability, I created an equation to achieve a desirable first arterial PO2. And so the way that I did this was I first, the amount of PO2, so the way that I did this was I took the venous PO2, subtracted it from my first arterial PO2. So that's going to give me the amount of PO2 produced from the oxygenator. Then I divided it by 10. So this is going to give me the amount of PO2 produced per 10% of FiO2. And I'm going to call this variable the FiO2 index. And each group in this study has their own respective FiO2 index. So to ensure that each 10% increase in FiO2 produces a certain amount of FiO2 across the three groups, I did a one-way ANOVA test on the mean FiO2 index of the three groups. So as you can see from the table, group A had 39.8 FiO2 index, group B had 44.39, group C had 43.76. So they were all also pretty close to the median, which I don't have up here, but that just shows that they reflect the PO2 indexes from the group. So the mean FiO2 indices were not significantly different, so that increase for each 10% increase in FiO2 was consistent across the three groups, which is important. So this figure is showing the rise in PO2 per 10% of FiO2 for the three groups, starting at 21%. Using the group's respective FiO2 index. And this was all done by multiplying the FiO2 in multiples of 10, and I'll go into that on the next slide. So just for comparative purposes, this is the previous two figures on one graph. So the PO2s from the first figure obviously look much higher on the line of best fit and than the second figure that I showed. So this may seem like unconvincing, and one would assume that the FiO2 index would have a similar PO2 to the real clinical data, but for groups B and C, the slopes are actually pretty similar. So that gives me hope because they are showing a steady increase per 10% of FiO2. But a critique obviously would be temperature and BSA are not included in this equation. So I'm trying to just use this as a guide when conducting bypass. So if you do want a certain PO2 on bypass, BSA or weight is often used to roughly estimate what onset FiO2 you should use. But now I created something called this FiO2 index, and an equation can be used to get your first arterial PO2, the desired first arterial PO2 on bypass, sorry. This is the onset FiO2 equation. So just for example, if a perfusionist wanted to achieve a first arterial PO2 of 250 millimeters of mercury on bypass for a patient with a preoperative venous sat of 63, using the FiO2 index for the respective group, so in this case it would be the group the AMI standard group, which is 60 to 70%. So 250 millimeters of mercury divided by 44.39 that you see in that graph, multiplied by 10 would give you an starting FiO2 of 0.56. So for critique, some strengths were that this was a prospective study. I like that there was similar anesthesia technique used for each physician conducting the case. There were also no significant differences in the cardiac index and hematocrit. Some weaknesses were that this was a one-center study. Only one type of oxygenator was used. BSA temperature and other factors were not taken into account. So in conclusion, this has shown that AMI ISO standards for the venous inlet recommendations do not reflect the clinical scenario, with only 21.6% of patients in this study falling within the AMI ISO testing range for venous inlet venous sats. And only 18.9% of patients in this study fall within the AMI ISO testing range for venous inlet hematocrit. So also preoperative SVO2s can be used as a guide for oxygenation control for patients that have pre-op venous sats of less than 70%. So for perfusionists that wish to achieve a desirable onset PO2, the onset FiO2 equation may be used to just help you get that first PO2 that you'd want. Future studies could include more centers to emphasize the drastic number of patients that don't fall within this AMI regulatory range, and use other oxygenators and account for temperature, BSA, O2 transfer, etc. They obviously have an impact on that first arterial PO2, and they should be accounted for. So future studies that account could formulate a more accurate FiO2 index. So AMI standards should reconsider the recommendations for testing these oxygenators, as it poorly reflects the clinical scenario that we see in the operating room every day. The oxygenator and all equipment used during a case should be tested to the highest degree. This is of utmost importance. And these are my references. I just wanted to acknowledge my program director. Thank you for all your help these last 2 years. My preceptors and perfusion.com, all of you guys have been great, and I want to thank you guys so much for having me. It was awesome. Thank you.